Hello Storytellers, welcome to Bound by Words. If we haven't met yet, my name is Madie. I am a full-time editor and a fantasy writer, and today we are talking about why you should make scene cards while you're drafting a story. So if you're working on a story and you want to captivate your audience, make sure you give this video a thumbs up and also consider subscribing while you're down there. I post writing related videos twice a week. But yeah, with that, I just want to jump right in. So if you aren't familiar with scene cards, the biggest function they serve is like a tool for developmental editing. So a lot of people who do scene cards, they use them to collect some metadata on each of the scenes, and there are a bunch of different ways that you can do scene cards. I highly recommend looking into it. You can include like what characters are in each scene, where the scene takes place. That's especially good if you have a lot of traveling. If there's like a date or a time that the scene takes place, and then like a little summary of what goes on. I know a lot of scene cards recommend putting the like what is happening, why it's happening, and why it's important to the story. There's a bunch of different ways that you can attack scene cards, but all in all, it is a tool to help you when you're developmentally editing, to help you determine if a scene is necessary and if it should be moved or not. So if you ever have written a story and you had to do some like rearranging or compiling of scenes, if you have like a really low suspense moment, like this is really common with saggy middle syndrome, you'll take some scenes and you might like doctor them up a little bit. You might squish them together, you might move some around just to make the story either tell a little bit smoother or have like a greater like tension suspense factor for that part of the story. I think they're an incredible tool, and if you're a plotter, you're probably extremely familiar with scene cards. A lot of people will do them with their outline, so there's a lot of Preptober videos that I've seen that were recommending, doing your outline and your scene cards. That way you have everything squared away, and if you do that developmental editing with your outline, it does cut out like a lot of extra fluff that might happen with your manuscript. And while I think it's really great to developmentally edit with your outline, I do think there's like an added benefit of filling out scene cards while you write. Now, I'm not saying you don't fill them out beforehand. Like if that works really well for you, then go ahead and fill them out beforehand as well if it helps with, your planning and organizing. But I think everybody should fill out scene cards, whether you're a plotter, a pantser, discovery writer, whatever you want to call yourself, to fill out scene cards while you're writing. And there are a few reasons why I think it really makes the self-editing process a lot easier in the long run. The first reason is to just get this squared away. Get all of your ducks in a row now so that the self-editing process goes a little bit more smoothly whenever you're done drafting. So when you're finished with your first draft, or sometimes even your second or third draft, you'll have to go through rounds of developmental editing. I'm pretty sure every novel needs this. You should really look at every single scene and say, is this important? Does this hit all of the right notes? Is there anything in here that sort of holds the story back, or if there's anything in here that distracts the reader? So because it's such an important stage in the editing process, it makes sense to draft in a way that sets up for that writing. It's almost just like prepping to get it done in the future. A lot of people actually will finish their draft and they'll let it rest for a little while, and then they'll go back and they'll read it and they'll rewrite an outline, or they'll rewrite scene cards after they're done drafting based on what they've read. I think that's really great too, because it gives you a little bit of a distance from your manuscript so that you can, reevaluate your story with fresh eyes. But if you're making those scene cards while you're drafting, then it's already done for you whenever you're ready to go into that developmental editing stage. And as you read, you can sort of comparatively look at your scene cards and make notes instead of spending the time to create them from the get-go. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more later, but essentially it just gets everything set up for the first round of developmental editing, and then you don't have to worry about it, or you don't have to spend as much time on it whenever you move into that stage. Another huge reason why I think it's really important to do scene cards while you're drafting, even if you do them other times, why I think it's important to do them while you're drafting, is because you'll get the most accurate version of your scene cards when it comes to what you wrote, how you wanted it to come across, and like what actually happened. So there's a few things I think that can go awry when it comes to scene cards. If you make them before your story, before you start drafting your story with your outline, you have so much opportunity for little things to change, and you can always go back and change those original scene cards as you write, but it can be a little bit tedious. So if you make them beforehand and you also make them while you're drafting, then you have like a before and after sort of snapshot. You can even compare those two when you're developmentally editing. So having them made while you're drafting will make sure that, what happens in each scene is accurately depicted in the scene card, the characters are correct, the timing is correct. If you write off of your outline at all, or if your story changes, it's really common for stories to change in the drafting process. Some people outline flawlessly and are able to execute their story exactly how they outlined it. Some people outline, pretty thoroughly, and halfway through there's some huge shift that affects the story a lot later like on. So instead of stopping and readjusting all of your scene cards that you made before you started drafting, if you just continue to make them while you're drafting, then you'll have like an accurate and updated version of these scene cards for whenever you're moving into the developmental editing stage. As an added bonus, whenever you have these scene cards and you're filling them out as you're writing, and you don't even have to fill them out like write a scene, fill out the scene card. You can write, a couple tens of thousands of words, and then maybe you have a day where you're like, I don't really want to draft, but I want to be productive. You can go back then and then organize your scene cards in like small chunks like that. But I think another good thing that you can do is make notes on your scene cards about like the mood that you wanted to set, the tone that you wanted to set, maybe how you wanted it to come across, if you want certain characters to be likable or not. This is really great when it comes to like editing notes, and there's like two reasons why. The first is whenever you go back and read it, it might not actually read the way that you intended it whenever you were writing it. You might have written it in a way that felt like you were describing a situation with a certain mood or tone with a certain amount of suspense, but then when you go back and read it after letting it rest or just after finishing your manuscript, you might realize that it doesn't really read the way that you intended in the first place. So having those notes on the scene cards as you're writing them is a great way to sort of hold yourself accountable or to make notes to future you whenever you're going back to editing. And other notes that you might want to make to future you, other than, if it's reading the correct way, are just changes that you want to make, whether they are large or small in the manuscript as you're writing. I know a lot of people do like brackets. If you skip scenes or you add things, they might put brackets on their manuscript, and in the brackets they'll write, insert this kind of scene here, or like find a better transition for this here. I think scene cards are a great place for that, and Scrivener actually has like a really good system if you use Scrivener for writing, for attaching a card right on each document of your manuscript for that reason, so that you can have some extra notes that are relevant to your manuscript and they tie into certain spots but are also separate from the prose. So if you don't use Scrivener, or maybe you're just like an on-paper person, scene cards are a great way to get around that. Adding editing notes to your scene cards is a great way to like utilize that tool as well without having any kind of special software. So you can put notes of things that you want to go in and change, and just keep it separate from your manuscript. Some people write better if it's in your manuscript, but the point of this is like versatility. There's a lot that you can include in your scene cards that can really help you in the editing process. For example, if you're making bigger changes, even if you're drafting and you're like, I just decided that like scenes 1, 2, and 3 were supposed to be in one location, and then 4, 5, and 6 are supposed to be in a second location. If you decide that scenes 1 and 2 are going to be in the first location and you're moving scene 3 to the second location, making a little note like that in the scene card associated with that will help you smooth out any like transitional things or any references whenever you're editing. So you might finish scene 3 and go, I think that would write better if it was in this setting. Making a note like that on the scene card will help you make sure that all of the changes you've made in scene 3 to reflect that are, accurate and up to date if you're going back and editing and you might get a little bit confused. I think it can be really easy sometimes to confuse yourself, and I don't know if it's just like the sheer amount that we create and we write. For myself, it's because I have a terrible memory, but if I tell myself I'll remember why I made this decision later, there's like I want to say a 50-50 chance I probably wouldn't, but it's more like an 80-20 chance I probably wouldn't. So having a place to leave those notes while you're writing, if you're making any kind of changes like that, I think it's just invaluable to the editing experience. It takes away a lot of stress when you're moving things around. Which brings us to the next point that I wanted to talk about, is that it will make the editing process more efficient whenever you finish your manuscript. I think scene cards are really used in the rougher stages of developmental editing, but I do think that some variation of that developmental editing should be used for every single manuscript. Even if you don't have physical scene cards, and even if you don't take your manuscript apart the same way, like scene by scene, I think that level of evaluating what's going on and if it's important to the story, how it contributes, and how it compares to the things right before and after it, that should be done for every manuscript. Nothing is worse than having several scenes that have the same amount of like tension and the same amount of pacing, because if it's a slow pacing, the story's going to be boring and feel like it's going nowhere, and if it's a fast pacing, either your reader's going to feel overwhelmed or they're going to feel like they're speed running the story, and both things are bad. So every story should evaluate this, even if you don't use scene cards. But if you do, making them while you're in the drafting stage and while you're working through the first part of your novel can help you get through this stage of the editing a little bit quicker. We see a lot of the like aesthetic boards when it comes to scene cards. You'll see like Kanban boards, or you'll see like the colored note cards that are color coordinated. I think that's really awesome too. And one of the things that I think is so intimidating by that is the level of organization and detail that has to go into color coordinating and organizing those scenes. But if you have scene cards that you have been writing as you're drafting that are, you know, accurate and up to date and have all the information and maybe even some editing notes, you can go back through your manuscript and you can address all of the editing notes you made to make them consistent and, you know, make any changes that you need. And then whenever you move into that stage of developmental editing with the pretty color coordinated index cards or with the Kanban boards, you have a good eagle's eye view that you can use to create those cards quickly. I want to say quickly, but that's not really the right word. I want to say efficiently again. You can use that to make these cards pretty seamlessly, because you'll look at your scene cards and you'll say, okay, these have these characters, this touches on this topic, so this has this subplot. I see people color code for like romance and subplots, or if you have any specific genre tropes that are common or expected. For example, in like romance, a lot of people expect a happily ever after or happily for now, or they expect some sort of like resolution. So when you have those like subplots, it's important to make sure that most, if not all of them, are tied up at the end. So color coordinating can help you really visualize those things. That's why a lot of people use those index cards. It can help you visualize if some subplots are, you know, too fast in some areas or maybe don't have an ending in other areas. So having that eagle's eye view to be able to make those index cards or post-it notes or however you're organizing it from updated scene cards, it makes things run a lot smoother, I promise. It's something that, you know, it might not work for everybody, but I definitely recommend that everybody try it once because it will make you pretty aware of a lot of things. So if you like the idea of color coding index cards, but it's never really been easy or convenient, maybe making scene cards while you're writing will help that be more attainable for you. It's almost like when you have like a big goal and you break it down into smaller goals. So if your big goal is to be able to developmental edit with those color coordinated cards, then a smaller goal would be deciding how you're going to organize the cards and then pulling apart your manuscript into, you know, are you doing scenes? Are you doing chapters? How do you want to separate it on the cards? And then divvying up the information in your manuscript through that sort of like funnel. But if you already have your scene cards made, then it's already divvied up and you can really just make those bigger decisions, like how do you want to do the color coding, and if you want to do scenes or chapters, then you can pull straight from your scene cards and throw them right on like a good visual representation. And I know when I say scene cards, a lot of us visualize those little index cards, but a lot of people when they're creating scene cards will create them in a document, you know, whether it's a Word document or a Scrivener template or something digital. There's a lot of novel planning softwares that have like a scene card function or format. So that's really what I'm referencing when I'm talking about this, but a lot of people do that same formatting on individual index cards from the beginning, and that would work just as well. If you organize all of your scenes on index cards handwritten while you're working, and then whenever you go back through to color code them, you can very easily create like a system just by separating the things that you've already marked on the scene cards. And there are three main things that I think scene cards that are incredibly important for, and that's why I wanted to talk about, you know, making scene cards while you're drafting or just having them in general today, because I feel like these three things particularly, you really have to break apart your story into segments to make it work out efficiently. The first one is cutting and joining scenes, like we talked about earlier. It's hard to cut and join scenes if you don't have separate scenes, but you know, you can do paragraph by paragraph. I just think that's a little bit harder to mentally digest, but maybe that's not true for everybody. A lot of people do like bullet point through bullet point. If you just do an outline, like that sort of setup, then you can see things that you might need to squish together or things that you might need to delete or relocate as a whole. The second big thing is for collecting metadata. Metadata is something that I think is super important, but can be super frustrating when it comes to novel writing and book writing in general, because it's important to have when you're publishing for libraries, and you know, if you're selling any books online or even Barnes & Noble, they all have different metadata systems where they want to know what your book is about in a brief number of words so that they can market it to readers. That is literally the sole purpose of like metadata. It's like book SEO. So you're going to need to find keywords to describe your book by the time you're done writing. And I think scene cards can really help with that because you can put like a scene into a couple words involving tropes, genres, and tones a lot easier than you can a whole book. So if you're looking at all of your scene cards at the end, whether they're color-coded or not, whether they're hand laid out or they're digital, you can look at the metadata or description you put on each of the scene cards to get a bigger picture idea of what's going on in your novel as a whole. If 60% of your scene cards have, romance or some sort of romantic something going on in them, then that might be a metadata term you want to use. If 50% of them have action, if maybe 25% of them have some form of religion or culture, that kind of thing you can see on a bigger picture. You can rank sort of how you've described those things. You can look up synonyms, and I just think that it's a lot easier to say, these 5 pages are overly romantic or these 5 pages are really run by action and travel than it is to look at a whole book and try to break it down into its most important components. So if you're planning on publishing, whether you're doing it, officially as a bound book, as an ebook, or even just casually online on your personal platforms, it can be really good just to have that in your mind while you're drafting. The third reason that scene cards are incredibly important, or at least the third reason we're going to be talking about today, is for improving tension and consistency. And I know what you guys are thinking. We all have tactics for keeping things consistent, making sure the characters' names are the same on page 1 as they are on page 50, making sure they have the same physical descriptions and stuff like that. Everybody has tips and tricks for that. That's why we hire editors, but it goes beyond that. There is a consistency in tone, there's consistency in dialogue use, there are consistencies in cultures. If you think about it, if the book is written in character A's point of view, then all of the prose are going to be the way character A would think or speak. That might be a little bit different than the way character B has dialogue. Maybe character 3 uses a specific style of slang, and marking these scene cards as you're writing and really including everybody who shows up in a scene, even if it's just for a few moments, will allow you to really hone in whenever you're making sure these things are consistent. For example, if character 3 uses a slang, but that might change throughout the drafting process, you can look at your scene cards and you can say, okay, character 3 or character C is in, each one of these 10 scenes, and I have to look at them individually to make sure that I stayed consistent with the type of slang that they would use. It's something that would be a little bit more overwhelming and really easily missed if you were just doing it as you were reading through the manuscript. So there's an added bonus when it comes to consistency. As far as tension goes, I feel like we've already talked about that a little bit, making sure your scenes, that you don't have too many that are the same pace and tension right in a row. That way you have those fluctuating, over emotional, easy to connect to feelings. As far as tension goes, we already talked about that a little bit whenever it comes to making sure that you have a good tension throughout your book and a good pacing that also varies, because if you have the same tension and the same pacing all throughout your book, it's going to feel a little bit daunting or overwhelming to the reader. I feel like high tension is one of those things that, can happen. One of the reasons Sarah J. Maas books I feel like were incredibly popular is because the ACOTAR series, specifically the first couple of books, it is so high stress, but those high stress scenes are separated. If you go back through and you read the book, they are separated by slower scenes just to keep it easy to read and understand without getting overwhelmed or confused. So it's not that you have to have boring sections of your book to break up the 10 sections. It's that you have to have a little bit of a lull sometimes so that your readers can really feel and appreciate the tension. I like to equate it to when you use too many exclamation points, they really lose their value. So, narrow down the points that you have tension will make them a lot stronger and resonate a lot more with your reader. So with that, if you enjoyed this video or if you learned anything about scene cards, then please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing while you're down there. I post writing related videos twice a week. And as always, if you have any tips for writing scene cards or any reason why you think scene cards would be good or bad to write while you're drafting, put them in the comments below so that we can help our fellow readers out. And I will see you guys next time.